History, as we so often receive it, is a story told in the loudest possible voice. It's a narrative of grand gestures, of spotlights, of booming declarations and public triumphs. We are drawn to the names etched in marble, the faces on the currency, the families who seem to occupy a different, more radiant plane of existence. And in America, for the better part of a century, no name has echoed with more resonance, more glamour, and more tragedy than Kennedy. We know their stories intimately. We know the triumphs of Jack, the moral crusade of Bobby, the endurance of Ted, the grace of Jackie. We know the compound at Hyannisport, the touch football games, the sailing excursions, the weight of a legacy that felt at times like the nation's own. The Kennedys are not just a family. They are an American epic, a dynasty whose every wedding, every birth, and every funeral becomes a chapter in our collective story. But this isn't just a story of glamour, it's a story of expectation. The sheer crushing weight of that expectation is a character in itself. To be born a Kennedy was to be born into a narrative already written for you. You were public property from your first breath. Your triumphs were not your own, they belonged to the legacy. And your failures? They were national disappointments dissected in newspapers and whispered about at dinner tables across the country. It was a life lived in a gilded cage where the bars were forged from the love and adoration of a public that demanded you be more than human. This is not a story about that epic or about those who thrived in that cage. This is not about the people who lived in the spotlight. It's about someone who stood adjacent to it, who was, for a time, at its very center, and who made the conscious, remarkable, and almost revolutionary decision to walk away from it and to disappear so completely that she has become a whisper, a footnote, a question mark. This is the story of Emily Ruth Black. If you've heard the name, you are in a small minority. Yet for 12 years, she was a Kennedy. She was the first wife of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., the son of the slain senator, a man who carries one of the most potent names in modern history. She was the mother of two Kennedy heirs, Robert F. Kennedy III and Kathleen Kennedy. She was, by all measures, poised to be a significant figure in the third generation of this storied clan. And then she vanished. Not physically, but from the public narrative. She was, as some have noted, the first wife left behind by the Kennedy historical machine. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't give tell-all interviews. She didn't appear in the endless documentaries dissecting the family's legacy. She simply left. Today we are pulling that quiet story from the shadows. We are going to explore the life of a woman who chose privacy over prestige, dignity over drama, and a life of her own making over one pre-written for her by a name she, for a time, shared. It is a story about the deafening noise of fame and the profound enduring power of silence. To understand Emily's choice, we must first understand the world she entered. Let's go back to the late 1970s and early 1980s. The America that Emily Black was coming of age in was a nation grappling with a deep sense of disillusionment. The soaring optimism of the 1960s, the era that defined the first generation of Kennedys, had given way to the cynicism of Vietnam, the disgrace of Watergate, and the economic malaise of the me decade. The cultural pendulum was swinging away from communal idealism and toward a harder, more individualistic, and more cynical materialism. The Kennedy family itself was in a period of complex transition. The grand patriarchs JFK and RFK were gone, canonized as martyrs. The family was now led by Senator Ted Kennedy, a figure both powerful and deeply flawed, forever living in the shadow of his brothers and the tragedy of Chappaquiddick. The matriarchs, Rose and Ethel were symbols of stoic endurance, holding together a sprawling, boisterous, and increasingly complicated clan. Into this new generation stepped the children, known as the Cubs. They were coming of age bearing a name that was both a tremendous privilege and a crushing burden. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., born in 1954, was the third of 11 children. He was the son of a man universally mourned, a scion of the liberal political line. But he was also, by his own public admission, a young man grappling with profound personal demons, including a well-documented struggle with drug addiction that had begun in his teenage years after his father's assassination. He was charismatic, brilliant, and deeply troubled, embodying the very paradox of the Kennedy legacy. The public watched him, waiting to see if he would rise to the impossible expectations set for him, or if he would become another casualty of the Kennedy curse. And then there was Emily Ruth Black. She was, in every conceivable way, his opposite. Born on October 15, 1957, she was a daughter of the Midwest, raised in Bloomington, Indiana. Her family was not political, not part of the East Coast aristocracy. They were grounded, academic, and intensely private. This was not a world of dynastic expectations. It was a world of Midwestern values, of hard work, and of intellectual pursuit. Let's linger for a moment on that contrast. Think of the landscape. The Kennedy world was the dramatic, turbulent, windswept coastline of Cape Cod, a place of sudden storms, competitive sailing, and high drama. Emily's world was the flat, stable, fertile soil of Indiana, a place of quiet horizons, 4 distinct seasons, and a belief that your worth was measured not by your name, but by your deeds. Her upbringing wasn't about public service as performance. It was about community, integrity, and a kind of grounded seriousness that the flashy, chaotic Kennedy world often lacked. Emily was described by those who knew her as Tram Lang Va Keen Jiao, quiet and discreet. She was whip-smart, driven, and focused. She didn't seek the spotlight, she sought excellence. Her path led her not to debutante balls or political rallies, but to the hallowed, demanding halls of the University of Virginia School of Law, one of the most prestigious legal institutions in the country. She entered UVA not as a somebody, but as a brilliant student, a mind to be honed. The campus, with its Jeffersonian ideals of intellectual rigor and public service, was a perfect fit for her. It was a place where ideas, not personalities, were meant to be the main event. It was there, sometime around 1980, amidst the Jeffersonian architecture and the immense pressure of a T14 law school, that her world collided with his. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was also a student at UVA Law. We can only imagine the scene, the campus buzzing with the presence of a Kennedy, the son of the Robert F. Kennedy. He would have been instantly recognizable, a figure of intense curiosity, admiration, and gossip. People would have either fawned over him or judged him, but no one would have been neutral. And in that same environment, there was Emily Black, a serious-minded student, focused on her casebooks, likely uninterested in the social drama. What drew them together? Perhaps it was that very difference. Perhaps for a man like Bobby, who had lived his entire life under the microscope, who was constantly surrounded by people who either wanted something from him or wanted to be him. Her quiet intelligence, her grounded nature, and her utter lack of interest in his Kennedy-ness was the most compelling, most refreshing thing in the world. She wouldn't have been impressed by the name. She would have been impressed by his mind, which, by all accounts, was just as sharp as hers. She was not in any way a Kennedy type. The women typically drawn into that orbit were often either from similar aristocratic backgrounds or were vibrant, outgoing personalities, ready to embrace the public-facing role. Emily was an intellectual. She was a lawyer in training, a peer, and equal in intellect. Their connection was seemingly forged not at a society party, but in the shared language of the law, a meeting of two very sharp, if very different, minds. For him, she may have represented a kind of peace, a stability, a normal life that he had only ever seen from a distance. On April 3rd, 1982, they married. The event itself was a mirror of her personality. It was a quiet, private affair, not the grand, quasi-royal wedding one might have expected. It wasn't a Camelot spectacle. There were no breathless television reports, no crowds lining the streets. It was an act of union, not a public proclamation. She was 24, he was 28. Emily Ruth Black, the quiet lawyer from Indiana, was now Mrs. Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. She had officially stepped into the whirlwind. The 12 years of their marriage, from 1982 to 1994, are a study in deliberate obscurity. This is the period where her choice for privacy becomes truly, radically apparent. As a Kennedy wife, expectations typically included visibility at Hyannisport, fundraisers, and campaign events. This was the family, after all, that had essentially invented the modern concept of political celebrity. Their entire lives were a performance for the public good, or at least for the public eye. Emily, it seems, politely declined the part. While Robert F. Kennedy Jr. began to build his formidable reputation as a groundbreaking environmental lawyer, co-founding the Riverkeeper organization and becoming one of the most prominent activists in the country, Emily remained almost entirely unseen. She was a lawyer, a graduate of the same elite law school as her husband, yet there is virtually no public record of her career during this time. But let's not mistake quiet for passive. It's easy to paint her as a wallflower, but it's more likely her silence was functional. Her husband was a man of intense mercurial energy, a crusader. Crusaders need an anchor. It's highly probable that her quiet, stable, Midwestern sensibility acted as an anchor for him. While he was out fighting public battles and saving the Hudson River, she was the one providing the private, intellectual, and emotional foundation that kept his world steady. And what of her own sharp legal mind? It's hard to believe a UVA law graduate simply stopped thinking about the law for 12 years. A more compelling picture is that of a private partner. Perhaps she was his first reader, his most trusted counsel, the one who read his legal briefs and sharpened his arguments before he took them public. Her contribution may not have been on a podium, but in the quiet, rigorous intellectual work that happened long before the cameras started rolling. This was not a woman who was simply camera shy. This was a conscious, strategic withdrawal. She chose instead to focus on her family. She gave birth to 2 children, Robert F. Kennedy III in 1984 and Kathleen Alexandra Kennedy in 1988. This, it seems, was her chosen vocation, to raise her children outside the deafening roar of the Kennedy machine, to give them a sense of normalcy that her husband had never known. Think of the emotional and psychological strength this required. Imagine being at the legendary Kennedy family gatherings, the Thanksgivings, the Christmases, the summers at the Cape, gatherings filled with senators, journalists, artists, and activists, all vying for attention, all part of Ethel's famously boisterous and chaotic brood. The noise level, the sheer number of people, the competitive sailing, the brutal touch football games, the loud, argumentative dinners. It was a culture of performance. And in the middle of it all, there was Emily, the quiet and discreet one. Biographers of the Kennedys, when they mention her at all, often use terms like serious, studious, or a bit of an outsider. She was reportedly not one to join the raucous, sometimes cruel teasing that was a family sport. We can picture her, not at the center of the lawn, but on the porch, reading a book. We can see her taking her two young children for a walk on the beach, away from the main house, creating a small, quiet bubble of their own within the larger storm. She was an observer, not a participant, in the performative aspect of Kennedy life. This choice created an invisible shield around her and her children. While her husband was out saving the Hudson River, becoming a public hero, Emily was at home, building a private world. She was the anchor, the quiet center, in a life that was otherwise defined by her husband's intense public advocacy, and, as would later become clear, his ongoing personal struggles. This period was not without its share of family darkness. In 1984, the same year her first child was born, Bobby's brother, David Kennedy, died of a drug overdose in a Palm Beach hotel room. It was a brutal reminder of the family's tragic fault lines. How did this event and the constant shadow of grief and self-destruction that hung over that generation affect her? We can only speculate that it reinforced her resolve. This wasn't just a distant family tragedy. It was a fire bell in the night. David's death was a direct result of the pressures and traumas that came with the Kennedy name. A trauma that had started for him with his own father's assassination. For Emily, married to a man who had his own public history with addiction, this tragedy must have been absolutely terrifying. It wasn't an abstraction. It was a clear and present danger. It must have made her mission to protect her own small family unit, to insulate her children from the more damaging aspects of their own legacy, all the more urgent. She was living inside a Greek tragedy, and she seemed to be doing everything in her power to write her own quiet domestic drama instead. But the most telling untold story of Emily's life isn't an event. It's the lack of them. It's the gaping hole in the archive. In an era before the internet, where privacy was easier to maintain, she nonetheless achieved a level of invisibility that was, for Kennedy, almost miraculous. Unlike many who might seek the spotlight, she refused every opportunity for exposure, deliberately keeping her life off the record. She was simply Mrs. Kennedy, a name on a legal document, a mother to two children, and beyond that, a mystery. This complete and total dedication to privacy, while married to one of the most public men in America, is perhaps the most revealing insight into her character. She was a woman who knew from the very beginning exactly who she was and who she was not willing to become. The quiet life she had so carefully constructed came to an abrupt and public end in 1994, and it is here that her story tips from one of private choice to one of public controversy and ultimately erasure. The marriage which had been lived so quietly ended with a painful jolt. Emily and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. separated and filed for divorce. The reasons for the split remained private, as was her custom. But what happened next was anything but. The divorce was finalized in March 1994. Just weeks later, in April 1994, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. married Mary Richardson, a woman with whom he had been involved. The transition was shockingly, brutally swift. To make the public chronology even more stark, Mary was pregnant at the time of the wedding, and their first child, Connor Kennedy, was born just 3 months later, in July. This sequence of events is not just a historical debate, it's a raw human drama. For Emily, the woman who had spent 12 years building a private life and steadfastly avoiding the public eye, this must have been a devastating, humiliating experience. Her intensely private separation was instantly eclipsed by her ex-husband's very public new life. The media, which had largely ignored the quiet first wife for over a decade, now had a new, more dramatic story to tell, the passionate whirlwind romance of RFK Jr. and his new bride, Mary. This is the moment of her erasure, The narrative machine of the Kennedy family, abetted by the media, simply moved on. Mary Richardson, an architect and a vibrant, outgoing personality, was a much better fit for the Kennedy wife mold. She was photogenic, articulate, and comfortable in the spotlight. She looked the part. She was, unlike Emily, ready to be a public partner. The machine values forward momentum, bright new objects, and a good story. A quiet, academic, departing wife was not a good story. A new, beautiful, pregnant wife was a great story. And so, the press, and by extension history, became complicit in this erasure. They simply stopped talking about Emily. She became the first wife, a bit of trivia, a preface to the real story. This wasn't just a passive forgetting. It felt like an active replacement. Her 12 years of marriage, her 2 children, her entire identity as a Kennedy were seemingly overwritten by the new, more compelling story. And this is where we must pause and consider the immense personal toll. To be so publicly and so quickly replaced is a profound kind of psychological wound. For a woman who valued her dignity and privacy above all, to have the end of her marriage play out as the prologue to someone else's love story is a unique and quiet kind of cruelty. But it is what Emily did next that truly defines her. In the face of this public humiliation and erasure, what would most people do? Some might lash out. They might write that tell-all memoir, sit down for a high-profile interview, fight for their place in the historical narrative. They might use the name Kennedy as a sword to demand attention, to tell their side of the story. Emily Ruth Black did the exact opposite. She doubled down on her silence. Her silence in the years after 1994 is even more profound than the quiet she maintained during her marriage. She did not engage. She did not comment. She did not participate in the public circus. She simply disappeared from view, taking her dignity with her. She reverted to her maiden name, Emily Ruth Black. This in itself was a powerful act. It was not just a legal formality. It was a profound statement of identity. She was shedding the name that had defined her and erased her and reclaiming the one that was truly hers. She was closing the 12-year chapter and returning to the person she had been before it all began. Emily Ruth Black, the one from Indiana. She left the Kennedy sphere of influence and reportedly moved to Washington, D.C. This choice, too, is fascinating. She didn't flee to a cabin in Montana or a beach in Mexico. She didn't retreat from the world. She moved to the other center of American power. But she chose to live in it on her own terms. She chose to be an anonymous professional in a city full of public figures. She chose to be a worker, not a personality. Her life after the divorce is a masterclass in quiet integrity. There is a listing in the Justia legal directory for an attorney named Emily Ruth Black in Washington, D.C. The profile lists her as a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Law, with decades of legal experience. It lists her practice areas, her bar admission. It is a simple, professional, and completely anonymous profile, one of thousands just like it. This is the only breadcrumb she has left for the public. She did not leverage her past. She did not market herself as the former Mrs. Kennedy. She returned to the identity she had forged for herself in Bloomington, Indiana, and Charlottesville, Virginia. She became simply Emily Ruth Black, Esquire. We can imagine her life's work, not in the dramatic courtroom brawls her ex-husband was famous for, but perhaps in the quiet, methodical, and deeply intellectual world of appellate law, research, or policy, work that suited her serious and studious nature. She continued to raise her 2 children, Robert F. Kennedy III and Kathleen Kennedy, far from the public glare. She gave them the gift of a life without the curse of Kennedy fame, a life where they could define themselves on their own terms. And it seems to have worked. Her son, Bobby III, is an artist and filmmaker, more comfortable behind the camera than in front of it. Her daughter, Kathleen, is even more private, having lived a life almost entirely outside the public eye. They are perhaps her greatest, quietest triumph. The consequences and historical significance of Emily Ruth Black's life are, therefore, immense precisely because they are so subtle. She is significant not for what she did, but for what she refused to do. In the grand, often tragic opera of Kennedy Women, Emily provides a stark and powerful counter-narrative. We have Jackie, the icon of tragic grace, a woman who understood the spotlight and learned to curate it, to control her own myth. We have Ethel, the indomitable, almost fanatical matriarch, a woman who seemed to fuel the dynasty with her own fierce energy. We have Joan, Ted Kennedy's first wife, a woman who crumbled under the pressure and the tragedy, who was consumed by the spotlight as her struggles became public fodder. And, in a heartbreaking turn, we even have Emily's replacement, Mary Richardson Kennedy, whose life also ended in tragedy in 2012, her own private battles becoming a subject of public consumption. All these women, in their own way, were defined and in some cases destroyed by the Kennedy name and the relentless public exposure that came with it. Emily Ruth Black is the exception. She is the one who got away. She is the one who faced the dazzling white-hot center of American fame, who lived within it for 12 years, and who, when it turned toxic, had the clarity and the strength to walk away completely, to choose her own survival and her own identity over the allure of a name. Her story forces us to re-evaluate our own obsession with fame. In our modern world, in the age of social media where fame is the ultimate currency and privacy is an almost archaic concept, Emily's life choice is more radical than ever. We live in a culture where people will do anything to be seen, to have their story told, to build a personal brand. Emily is the ultimate uninfluencer. Her life is a testament to the idea that a life unseen can be just as valuable, if not more so. She teaches us that there is a profound power in not telling your story. That silence can be a form of agency. That dignity is not about winning the public narrative, it's about refusing to play the game. Her story is also a quiet critique of the Kennedy legacy itself. It exposes the historical machine for what it is, a powerful force that consumes and curates narratives, often at great personal cost to the individuals involved. The machine requires drama, tragedy, and glamour. It has no room for the quiet, serious, intellectual woman who just wants to practice law and raise her children. Emily's story shows us the human cost of that machine, the people who are written out of the script because they don't fit the part. She wasn't a victim, however. That is the crucial takeaway. She was not erased against her will. She was a participant in her own disappearing act. The painful divorce and her husband's rapid remarriage may have been the catalyst, but the path of privacy was one she had been walking her entire life. She was pushed, yes, but she used that push to propel herself into a life she had perhaps always wanted, a life that was finally, completely her own. So what are we left with when we look at the life of Emily Ruth Black? We are left with a shape, an outline, an absence that speaks louder than any headline. We are left with a feeling of profound respect for a woman who navigated one of the most treacherous social and political landscapes in America and emerged not with fame or fortune, but with something far more precious, herself. Her life is not a grand, sweeping epic. It is a quiet, human-scale story of integrity. It's a reminder that not all strength is loud. Some strength is quiet, discreet, and resilient. It's the strength to know your own worth, separate from a famous name. It's the strength to build a life in the shadows, not because you are hiding, but because you are protecting something sacred. Emily Ruth Black will never have a monument built for her. Her name will not be etched in marble, but her story, the story of the woman who said no to the Kennedy dynasty, is a profound and moving lesson in the fragile, beautiful, and enduring power of a private life. In a world that demands we share everything, her ultimate legacy is the one she so carefully crafted, a legacy of dignified, powerful, and complete silence. And perhaps her story asks us all a quiet question. In our own lives, with the noise of the world getting louder every day, what parts of ourselves do we choose to protect? And what is the value of a life that is, in the end, truly and only our own?